Hello, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. This is part 3 in our series on rape culture. If you missed any of the previous entries, the links are in the description below, and if you're all caught up, let's just get right back into it. Last time we were talking about a transition in our modern understanding of rape, a transition away from sex against the will towards sex without someone's consent. And we are picking up now with some of the consequences of that transition in our society. This feminist philosophy of consent only as the sole basis of sexual morality has re-engineered the concept of rape into a fairly broad spectrum of behavior, all of which could be labeled as sexual assault, depending on the context that you're in. So you can think of one large bucket that holds a fairly diverse set of bad behavior, all of it linked by being some kind of sexual act directed at somebody who has not consented to it. Now, this spectrum certainly includes what people would normally think of as rape, namely forcibly violating somebody against their will, usually violently, although not necessarily. And rape is, of course, about as heinous of an act as is possible for one person to do to another. It demands retribution. And so no civilized society is going to tolerate rape. It has to be an issue of temporal justice. Now, to be sure, temporal justice is not perfect. It has its errors, it makes its mistakes. And so sometimes rapists will escape punishment, and sometimes victims will be mistreated by the system itself. But despite its warts and despite its flaws, a civilized people will always need to pursue justice in the matter of rape to the extent of their ability to carry out criminal justice. So when we're speaking about rape in that sense, it is clear-cut, it is severe, and it is absolutely the proper work of our criminal justice system to adjudicate a matter like that. But sexual assault, this large bucket category, it also encompasses things that you could describe merely as unwanted sexual contact. Basically, somebody touches you, or according to some people, even speaks to you in a sexual way that isn't welcome. And this can be anything from groping all the way to catcalling, which I've seen some people describe as a kind of mini rape. Basically, anything sexual at all without consent. And when you look at this part of the category objectively, what you find is that pretty much everybody, male and female alike, is a victim of sexual assault in that kind of sense, that unwanted sexual contact kind of sense. Now, we don't think about it objectively because sexual assault, the connotation of that is deeply tied to rape, and so we think of sexual assault as necessarily terrible, necessarily heinous, necessarily traumatic. And sometimes unwanted sexual contact really is. But a lot of it isn't heinous. A lot of it doesn't really demand retribution in the same way that rape would. And here's my Me Too story. In my freshman year of high school, there was a period of time for about 2 weeks where I'd be walking down the hall and I'd feel somebody, slap my butt and then grab a big handful of it. And I would look around and I could never tell who it was. Because my high school was a big place. There were over 3,500 students there. And the halls were very, very full during passing periods. So it would happen, I would look around, I couldn't figure out who was happening it, but for a period of about 2 weeks. Almost once a day, this would happen. It would be slap, grab, and then I couldn't tell what was going on. So this continued for a while, and until finally one day it happened to me while I was standing at the bus stop, talking to a friend of mine, and there weren't a whole lot of people around, and I felt it again, and I immediately turned around, and there was a sophomore girl sitting behind me, just looking up with a big smile on her face. And I, of course, turned around with my mouth open, ready to put her in her place and tell her to knock it off. But she's just sitting there smiling, and then it kind of dawns on me, well, what do you actually say to a person in a situation like that? Please stop. That doesn't really cut it. So basically what I did, I just turned right back around. I continued my conversation with my friend as if nothing had ever happened. And that worked. She never actually did it again after that point. Which goes to show you, if you're getting that kind of unwanted attention, being polite usually doesn't help too much. Getting angry doesn't usually help too much. But just basic contempt, that's a good way of getting people to steer clear of you. So, yeah, that happened to me. It was 2 weeks. And it was wrong. She shouldn't have been doing that, certainly. And it made me feel uncomfortable, definitely. And I should have had to feel uncomfortable. But at the same time, it's not severe. It's one of those things where I can tell it now, and I chose that story. There are others I could tell, but I choose that one because it's mildly amusing. And mildly amusing stories don't happen on the rape end of the sexual assault spectrum. There are no amusing stories on that side. But on this unwanted sexual contact side, it's like, yeah, it's wrong, certainly, but it doesn't demand retribution. It's not heinous. I mean, it can be. Certainly, there are unwanted sexual contact that doesn't include, violation or intercourse. That's still terrible, especially when it gets mixed into bullying and things of that nature. So it can be terrible, but it doesn't have to be terrible. There are a lot of cases, like the one I described, which it's just not that big a deal. It's one of those stories that you tell that's kind of funny. And never with any of my own experiences, and there are other stories I could tell that are unfunny, but even with the unfunny ones, it never even occurred to me that, oh, that person needs to be punished for what they did. That was never really necessary. Occasionally thought would occur to me, it's like, well, maybe their parents should have taught them better, but not punishment, not retribution. So when you get this unwanted sexual contact on the other end of the sexual assault spectrum, it's usually pretty clear cut. I mean, it's always wrong, or at least almost always wrong. But the severity can be all over the place. It can go from very, very mild and innocuous to very, very severe, but all under that same category, unwanted sexual contact. And so it's very different. It's in the same bucket of sexual assault as rape is, but a lot of the behavior is very, very different than rape. And I don't think we're doing anybody any favors by lumping this sort of thing into the same category. But it does get included. As much as I'd like to just separate them into different descriptions, that's the language we're left with. People add that into the sexual assault category because, for the sake of getting the numbers, I mean, you're never going to get to those, 1 in 4 college girls are raped or 1 in 5 college women are being raped, without including stuff like that, stuff like unwanted sexual contact as some kind of mini rape to pad the statistics out. So yeah, you have a pretty broad spectrum. On one hand, you have a rape. On the other hand, you have unwanted sexual contact. And then in the middle, the other thing you end up with are a lot of really, really hard cases. And this is, in my opinion, where the bulk of rape culture really comes from, or at least what can plausibly be described as permitting or encouraging rape. And with these hard cases, I call them hard cases because they're not so clear-cut in describing who's wrong or where exactly the fault lies. And it's very, very hard to gauge the severity of what happened. How bad was it? Does it really deserve punishment in the same sense? And so you get all these different things mixed together, and rape, traditionally understood, that provides the moral urgency to this category of sexual assault. We have to do something about it. And the unwanted sexual contact end of things, that provides the sense that this is commonplace. It's everywhere. It's happening to everyone. But the bulk of rape culture is a lot harder to process. So what do I mean by hard cases? What do I mean by this big, almost gray area in the middle? Well, you have situations where it's very obvious that something is wrong. But at the same time, it's really difficult to sort out issues of who is at fault, who deserves to be punished. And I'm going to give you a few examples of this. Now, I'm trying to keep the gritty details on these examples as minimal as possible. But the whole point of having an example at all is to clarify an abstract concept with some concrete details. So I made the best judgment call I could as far as how much detail to include. Doesn't mean I'm right, but nothing in here is gratuitous. Each of these 3 examples that I'm about to give is here because they illuminate some facet of the situation that is stickier, that's harder to deal with, but is being debated in the whole conversation about rape culture. So first example, 2 college students, man and a woman, and they don't know each other, but they go to the same party, and they get pretty drunk, and they end up going back and having sex. So, that's a typical Friday night for a lot of people on a lot of colleges and universities. Is it rape? And by the way, I'm not asking these questions to answer them. I'm just asking them so that you have a chance to ponder them. Think about the answer to this. Is that rape? Because a lot of colleges and universities are starting to count it as rape because it's really hard to give meaningful consent when you're drunk. And it's very common in situations like this where one or both of the people involved don't even remember whether they gave or received meaningful consent. And so it is very reasonable to categorize situations like this as sex without consent. But at the same time, treating it as rape, well, that's pretty problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, in the situation I described, who raped who? If they're both drunk and they're both unable to give consent because they're inebriated, well, who raped who? Or did they both rape each other simultaneously? And I mean, that's the logical conclusion based on the affirmative consent standard, but it's also insane. I mean, you never think about rape that way, and two people are raping each other at the same time. That's crazy. So you don't count it that way. Or is it so who's at fault? Is it the victim who regretted it the most? Is it the first person in the couple to complain to somebody about it? Is that the victim? And that's really the practical conclusion of affirmative consent policies. And this is the sort of thing that actually happens. And this is pulled from an actual example that I read about this past spring. A woman was suspended from the University of Cincinnati because she was involved in a drunken hookup and was found guilty of non-consensual sex. And it seems, at least from the details I was able to glean from the stories, it seems that the guy who accused her did so because he was afraid that she was going to accuse him. Because she had apparently done so to a friend of his earlier in the year, and so he decided to beat her to the punch. So yeah, kind of a weird situation, but she was found guilty because he was the first one to complain. So is that rape? Does that make it rape, that first complaint? And would it matter if he swapped the genders? Because the only reason that kind of story made headlines is because it's the guy who accused the girl. In most cases, it's the other way around, and it's a dog bites man story. We don't hear about that a whole lot. Or at least we don't make a big deal of that a whole lot. Now, either way, any way you dice it, the situation's morally wrong, right? I mean, there's fornication, there's drunkenness, both of those are sins, and both of them were involved in those sins to a certain extent. But is it wrong in the way that rape is wrong? Does it demand retribution from one of them? Does it demand retribution from both of them? That's a whole lot stickier of a question to answer. Second example, more college students here. A woman has consensual sex with two men, one right after the other. And in the middle of intercourse with the second guy, she tells him, "I want to go home." And he responds, "Okay, just a second." And then he finishes up and then she goes home. Did he rape her? Does "I want to go home," does that revoke consent? Because there are a lot of ways to understand that statement. And on one hand, of course, it can mean, stop, I'm done with this. I don't want to do this anymore. And on the other end of things, it could mean, well, hurry up, I'm bored with this, just finish up and get out of here. And those are two different meanings. So how do you parse that? Did he rape her? And again, this one is again a true story. I pulled that from an example from, this was years ago that I read about this one, but she filed a complaint against him with the university because when she said, "I want to go home," what she meant was, stop, I'm done with this, stop immediately. And he, of course, took it in the sense of just hurry up, and he did. And so the guy was found responsible by his university. He was expelled, as I recall. So is that right? Is that a just punishment for a situation like this? Does it make any kind of sense for intercourse to become rape literally between one thrust and the next? What harm was done by the last few thrusts that wasn't done by the first few? And did what happened demand retribution of some kind because of the harm that was done? Can rape be a matter of simple miscommunication, as it seemed to be in this situation? Once again, I mean, there's sin and there's immorality all over this thing, but is it rape? Is rape among those sins? Because society's going to have to respond to that in a very different way, depending on whether that's rape. Last example, And this one's not a specific story like the other two were, but it is a typical one. Boyfriend and girlfriend. They are consensually, they're making out, and they're taking off clothes and so on and so forth. And the boyfriend moves on to intercourse. But the girlfriend didn't want it to go that far. Is it a rape? Now, if she said something like, no, stop, and she's pushing him away, but he just went ahead anyway, well, yeah, that would make it a pretty simple matter, right? Of course that's rape. But let's make the situation harder, because a lot of these situations are harder than that. And again, I'm not looking for answers here. I'm not giving you answers here. But I think we should all ponder the questions. What if she wanted to tell him to stop? But she didn't, because she was surprised. She wasn't expecting that to happen. And she got surprised. She got confused. And therefore, she didn't say anything in time. And once it was happening, she had a deer in the headlights kind of reaction, just wasn't sure what to do. Is that rape? What if she wanted to tell him to stop, but she was afraid he would get violent? And so she deliberately stayed silent and didn't say anything. Is that rape? What if she wanted to tell him to stop, but she was afraid he would get offended, and she really didn't want to offend him, so she deliberately stayed silent? Is that rape? What if she simultaneously wanted to and didn't want to at the same time? In other words, what if her sex drive were telling her one thing and her conscience were telling her another? What if she was of two minds of the subject and she didn't say anything because she hadn't really figured it out for herself? Is that rape? And how would a judge or a jury or a school administrator objectively tell the difference between any of those situations? How would the boyfriend tell the difference between any of those situations? How does the girlfriend tell the difference between all the situations? Because in a situation like that, we're not always clear about what's happening even in our own minds, let alone in somebody else's. So how much responsibility is there for one person to communicate in a clear manner what their intentions are and what their boundaries are? Doesn't make a difference if you swap the genders. If it's the guy who wasn't expecting things to go for that far, but the girl who pushed things further, does that make a difference? Does it make a difference if the couple had had sex in the past, if this wasn't their first time, if there's something they did regularly? Does that make a difference? And the other big question to ask is, to what extent does willingly engaging in behavior that would properly be considered foreplay, as behavior that prepares our bodies for sex, to what extent does foreplay actually communicate a consent to sex through body language? That's another serious question to consider. And again, I'm not answering those. I'm not telling you which one it is. But those are all important questions that we should go ahead and ponder. And some of the questions are easier than others. But all of them, every last one of them, is being debated in this whole controversy over rape culture. So I'm not going to tell you the answers here, but I will tell you three things we can say for sure about what's going on here. First, we can only be said to have a rape culture here in the U.S., a culture that encourages and permits rape, because of these hard cases, because this gray middle area is growing by leaps and bounds. And because that middle area, where it's just so confused and hard to tell what's going on, starts to feed into the other two categories, the rape on one side and unwanted sexual contact on the other, because of the ways our social expectations are so messed up when it comes to relationships. That's the first thing. Second thing, there is a lot of pain and a lot of hurt going on in situations like this. And that's true whether or not these examples count as rape. Because either way, there are two types of pain going on. There's the pain of being sinned against, and whether that's because you were taken advantage of, or because you were falsely accused, or because you were raped. Either way, that's painful. Somebody wronged you when something like that happens. And there's also the pain at the same time of being guilty of sin. Because in all those situations, again, however you parse the blame and whether it's rape or not, I don't think there was a single person in there who is completely innocent, who didn't do anything wrong, morally wrong, at least, in a situation like that. And if you think it's hard for you to answer those questions and to sort out exactly what happened, exactly where and what the blame is, imagine how hard it is for the people involved to sort all of that out. And for some people, that becomes this crushing burden of guilt, because the fact that they played some role in what happened to them, that just overshadows everything else. For other people, it becomes this crushing burden of bitterness and resentment. And whether it's a person who is taken advantage of or a person who is falsely accused, either way, they're something bad happened to me, and the fact that that evil was done to them, it just overshadows their own participation in the situation. And they end up getting bitter and thinking that, oh, well, the world's out to get me, or all men are out to get me, or all women are out to get me. And none of those are healthy ways to live. Those are all painful situations that people have to deal with. And regardless of what the legal remedy for all this is, they have a couple of other needs. First is that they need the gospel, both for the forgiveness of their sins and for that vindication of their pain, of what happened to them matters. And second, we all need the law. For the unrepentant, of course, they always need the law, but more than that, to try to help bring some sort of order to the chaos, to make some kind of sense out of what happened and how you got there, and showing that there is a way that things are supposed to work beyond just the confused, painful situations like this. And beyond gospel and beyond law, they also just need help. And whether that's just an understanding community or counseling from people who understand the dynamics that are going on, but it's very hard to bear these kinds of burdens alone. And the third thing I can say for sure is that, socially speaking, this problem is only solvable by getting that big gray middle area back down to size, where this sort of thing becomes rare and easily avoidable rather than normal and entrapping and corrupting. Not by being able to, parse out the right and wrong of every ethical angle in every one of these bizarre situations, or once bizarre situations that we find ourselves in, to make sure that all the blame is properly placed and all the retribution properly carried out. But it's more important to be fighting against the forces that are making those situations normal in the first place. I mean, my point in having everybody think about, is this rape and who's to blame in those different examples, it's not so they can get better at it necessarily, but it's to put it in perspective. It's a really difficult task compared to reworking our social expectations so that those things aren't normal anymore. And that's why next time, in part 4, we are going to start talking about hookup culture. Because it's really hookup culture that's driving this whole phenomenon by creating that huge middle section, that huge gray area, all those hard cases. In a very real sense, hookup culture is rape culture. I'm not saying that rape is the same thing as a hookup, but it's the same culture that produces both of those effects, and it really can't help but produce both of those effects. If you want a hookup culture, you are going to end up with a rape culture. And that is what we're going to talk about next time. So please like, comment, subscribe, and join us again for part 4 when we continue this series.